Welcome to The Holistic Nurse with your host, Peggy Smith. Peggy will introduce and educate her viewers about the differences between alternative, holistic, and complementary medical therapies. Her goal is to empower the lay medical consumer to learn how to advocate for themselves. So now, please welcome the host of The Holistic Nurse, Peggy Smith.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of The Holistic Nurse with Peggy Smith. Uh, in celebrating and respecting Mental Health Month, Awareness Month, which is the month of May, we're trying to have a different show every week on various mental health topics. And today we're going to be talking about the link between trauma and addiction with my guest, Dr. Michael Murphy. He is a neuropsychologist. He is joining us today. Hi, Mike. Welcome. Wonderful to
It's
have you
wonderful to
again.
be with you again and look forward to a great show. We're going to talk about a lot of really important stuff today.
I think a lot of people, unless it's an immediate family member, we don't realize that we're all like one step away from being where some of the people that are dealing with this are struggling. Tell us a little bit about your background and yourself, if you don't mind, to start off.
So I started out as a child a long, long time ago, but it was a long time ago. So anyway, yeah. So I actually majored in philosophy in college and have loved philosophy all of my life. Just trying to understand what life is about, why are we here, what's the purpose of our existence, all those kind of high-minded things that you study in philosophy class. And it's really interesting. So then I kind of decided, what do I do with this degree in philosophy? And the answer is I can think a lot, but you still have to feed yourself and sort of figure out how to live. So then I went to graduate school and I eventually became a psychologist, and I am licensed as a psychologist and have been practicing as a psychologist for many, many years, overseeing mental health care largely in jails and prisons and psychiatric hospitals, and testifying in trials as a forensic psychologist, like you see on TV, assessing people and then um, being interviewed and examined and cross-examined in trials in court, and then rendering an opinion with regard to what's going on. So it's been a very interesting journey, very complex, but I really have a lot of exposure to the issue of addiction because just about everybody who is in prison, and there are millions of people in the United States who have been in prison, are people who suffer from an addiction. So it's really a critical issue that is just incredibly widespread these days.
Yeah, we did a show a few months ago together where we talked about how addiction was not your identity. And I thought this month, with the mental health awareness, we will try to understand a little bit more. Um, like a lot of people think the problem is you're an addict and that's why you end up in jail. Um, but addiction, it might just be a survival strategy, for a whole bunch of, society failures or, physiological issues, experiences. Um, so today I thought we'd talk about how trauma and addiction are related to each other, and why healing can begin long before substance ever even happens, um, so that we don't go down that rabbit hole before it's out of control. Because the reality is, and since you're in the system, the services that people really need are not always accessible. So it's we're doing the best we can to provide help. Uh, in a compassionate way. And, I think you, especially as long as you're protecting yourself from burnout, myself the same in nursing. Um, how do you feel? We're not judging these people. Uh, and because that would be like judging ourselves, like I said, we're all one step apart from, we maybe have made different choices than some of the clients that you work with. Um, but sometimes you can't get the help you need if you unless you accept labels. That's a function of the way I think our insurance system works. Um, what is your understanding about, where does, how does trauma lead to addiction? To start off, I guess.
That's a great insight. And one of the things that I think is really fundamental to think about right from the start is what is addiction? And really, we started to understand in mental health in general that almost everything is on a spectrum. We all have some kind of dependency. If you think about addiction in terms of some kind of dependency. Some of us are kind of dependent on food. We love food. Sometimes some of us are dependent on exercise. Some of us are dependent on all kind candy, sugar, all kinds of ways that we find to soothe ourselves in some way. And when you think about the addictive process as being on a spectrum from things like that are relatively benign, they're not terribly harmful, but still, when they're overused, sugar, food, exercise, all can be managed in ways that are not so great for our well-being or our health. So thinking about that, thinking about addiction in terms of some form of dependency that is very common, and most of us have some of these elements with us. And when we think about addicts, the old way is just to think about addicts are people who are on the extreme of addiction, and their whole life is organized around these substances in a really destructive way. Well, that's on the extreme end of the spectrum. So what we're talking about, I think, is how we've come to understand in these times how global this issue of dependency is and how it really affects all of us. Almost every family has been affected by these kind of issues of substance use, substance dependency, and perhaps some of the negative implications of our dependency on something.
Well, I know in my nursing experience, which goes back over 4 decades, I remember when I was relatively new nurse working on a surgical floor. Um, I my eyes opened up to the fact that this was a small hospital, so some of the people were, normal patients, gallbladder, knee replacement, whatever, brought you there for a surgical floor, and they were people well known in the community, well functioning, high functioning, successful, but they weren't even aware about, and it was common, a glass of wine every night, is good for your heart, just like you say about dark chocolate. I think whatever somebody wants to sell can be good for your heart in the right commercial. But
Right.
what I was surprised to see, it had unexplained, just out of character behaviors from some of these patients, usually on the third day after they got there. Sometimes it was before surgery, right after. And we were kind of puzzled. And then a doctor explained to me that these people, although certainly functioning and would never have realized that they were physiologically addicted even to that little nightcap, or, little shot at night or a glass of wine to help relax. Some people are more prone to the physiological effects that addiction, whether it's medication, and sometimes it's prescription medication, alcohol, uh, even smoking, or smoking substances that, are not normally meant to be in the human body. Can you talk as a neuropsychologist about the physiological aspect of this before we get into the trauma? And can somebody recognize that they have that without looking at their ancestry.com profile?
That really is true. And surprisingly enough, genes do play a role in the development of addiction. It really has been shown that it does kind of run in the family. And if you do happen to be surrounded by people in your family network who have issues with dependency and substance misuse, if you will, then it does put you at a somewhat higher risk of becoming dependent, though anyone can. I mean, it certainly is the case that any human being who is prescribed a substance that tends to be extremely reinforcing for them, an opioid or a tranquilizer or alcohol, certainly, and many other drugs that over time will create a dependency in the human biological system. I mean, that certainly can happen to anyone, but it is really clear that there is a genetic predisposition to addiction and dependency, and it kind of runs in the family. So if you have that in your family, it's good to educate each other and educate your children and let them know that if you are a person who has a family history of addiction, that you yourself are at a higher likelihood of forming that dependency. I've talked to many people in jails and prisons. I've interviewed many thousands of people over decades of time, and I can't tell you the number of times when someone has said to me, I was an addict from my first drink. They picked up a drink and they just naturally rolled right into excessive use from the get-go. So that's a clear indication that that person had that genetic predisposition. So they really can't mess around with alcohol or drugs without putting themselves at a pretty high risk of forming a dependency.
I've talked to some outstanding high school athletes that maybe have a shoulder injury, an ankle injury, whatever. You automatically that I think they do it less now automatically, but they're given an opioid product as part of post surgery, and that's all. And 5 or 6 later, when the person's trying to get the help that he didn't realize back then, his parents didn't understand the process, the doctors didn't understand what was happening. Um, they're dealing with a full raging addiction, and it's not that they were engaged in illegal activities. It was something as simple as one prescription of a substance that their brain was wired that it's not good for them. I was adopted as an older child, and I didn't know my birth family in the beginning until I was in my 30s. But having met them, I realized, yes, my mother was a functional alcoholic. My father actually had passed away in his 40s, his other siblings, the same way from alcoholic complications. So I sat down with my kids who were like preteen at the time, and I said, this is in our family. I'm a nurse at this point. You're going to have to fight the normal temptations that, kids face. Only one of my boys was an altar boy, and he started by when the boys empty the cruets for the priest, they were emptying it not down the sink, but in their mouth. We're going to take a brief break right now and pick up more about trauma and physiological addiction when we come back. Thank you.
What if there were a super tiny device that could diagnose the brain and is smaller than a single human hair? What if you could see inside the brain to help an epilepsy patient during surgery or to help the fight against Parkinson's disease? Dr. Patricia Broderick is proud to announce the Broderick Probe, a biomedical and electronic breakthrough. Imagine a probe to help with the understanding and potential cure of brain-related diseases. To learn more, listen live to the Easy Sense radio show with host Dr. Broderick. And to help support the Broderick Foundation, please go to easysense.com and learn how, with your help, we can fight these horrific brain disorders. That's easysense.com to learn more and help support the Broderick Foundation. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness, Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals.
Hi, welcome back to this edition of The Holistic Nurse with Peggy Smith. My guest, Dr. Michael J. Murphy, a neuropsychologist, and I are discussing the links between trauma and addiction, and trying to leave you with the feeling that this is not your fault, but understand how you got there, how your family members are struggling. When we talk about trauma, a lot of times people think it's, your abused child, or, um, you had an accident maybe that, like I said, with that athlete, the previous accident ended up not knowing his body wasn't wired to be able to handle those kind of medications. But trauma is sometimes not that obvious. Uh, I'll be having a show in the near future on generational trauma to show like how our present behavior actually ties in with generations before us that we may not have ever known anybody in that generation. Um, and it can be as simple as, certain you grow up and your parents are kind of just mimicking what their parents and grandparents said because that's what you do as a parent. There's that moment when you're a parent, you realize you said something like that, and it's like, oh my God, I turned into my mother, you know. But little things like, for some children that are very sensitive, something like constantly saying, sit up straight, the child's going to think there's something wrong, or, they're always looking and let me see your face before we go out the door, and, it might be a normal thing. But the child might be have a hypersensitivity to things like that. Uh, Sometimes it's, little boys shouldn't cry, be a man, It's that for certain children, that can be a trigger and perceived as trauma. One addiction you didn't touch on is the whole hoarding phenomena. That usually comes from senses of loss, but it also can come from just trying to preserve something that makes you feel good and increases your self esteem, maybe the acquiring of certain objects. Um, Sometimes, if you feel like not even understanding, you're not feeling good about yourself, you accidentally find out, wow, a friend just gave me this and I'm on top of the world now. This is how I'll get through life. But it's not a conscious decision. Can you talk a little bit about what trauma can do and how maybe even to recognize ways of that you need help, or why you shouldn't do this on your own? It's a really difficult challenge to try to conquer this. Yeah, because you're trying to beat something that's here for generations. It's not your fault.
That's a great observation. And I think that, it's important to point out that one of our fundamental needs as human beings is for safety. And what does safety mean? I mean, safety means that as children, as little people, we're very vulnerable. I mean, we are typically that's why you're so sensitive as a child. We're hyper vigilant to the environment because we realize how vulnerable we are. So we're constantly seeking safety. And what is safety? But safety is a sense of psychological and emotional security when the nervous system is calm. So it's a state of being able to sit down and feel safe and not have to be frightened at that moment. One of the things that I experienced in the many thousands of interviews in jails and prisons in this country is when I ask someone, like, what was it like growing up in your family? And they use this word, chaotic, which is kind of an unusual word. It's sort of a sophisticated word, but they would say that their situation at home was chaotic. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they didn't know what they were going home to. They didn't know what they were going to find when they walked in the door after school or when they got home from being out with their friends. Maybe there was a different guy there or a different woman or different children. I mean, it was not a place where they felt safe. So that meant that their nervous system was constantly activated. They're sort of agitated, like the deer out in the woods that hears the branch crack and thinks, whoa, maybe someone's going to grab me now. That's the way it was for so many kids. So that kind of talks about the predisposition to wanting some kind of substance that will calm down your nervous system and give you that sense of safety that most people, certainly children, and even us as we grow older, are looking for. We want to be calm, we want to be safe, we want to be in an environment where we can relax. And so, so many people talk about the substance or alcohol, whatever, as a cup of courage. They're nervous and they're scared. So they take the substance and they feel better. It's very reinforcing. So you do that over and over again, and pretty soon you see, you have a dependency, and you're dealing with withdrawal, which you can talk about, certainly.
Right. And when you say you take this, a lot of times you're not taking that substance, maybe it's just peer pressure. So, oh, here, you want to hit on this, cigarette or, just one little drink, it'll make, then we'll enjoy the night more, different things like that. And it's not always, it's a spur of the moment type peer pressure sometimes. And, you know, sometimes, and it makes you realize, well, gee, I could have better feelings than I have, but you don't have the sophistication and experience to know that there's healthier ways to build your self-esteem. And you've been fortunate enough to have a really special teacher in your life. A lot of the kids that have come out of those chaotic homes, and they can tie it back to my first grade teacher. She believed in me, but everyone else told me I was too stupid to do what I want to be. You can't be a scientist. You can't even do, math problems or something, little subtle things. And the teachers weren't being malicious. They were just kind of parroting what they knew. And, women are no good in math. So a lot of women in a certain generation grew up to adulthood. And if you just chose that anyway against all odds, then you were just oppositional defiant all of a sudden. There goes those labels that we have. I think a lot of labels are created because the people that are judging you, they need a sense of safety and security. And it's a lot easier not to look at a human, but look at a label that the computer spit out or AI, And that's one of the dangers, I think, of AI therapy. I don't think we have enough experience yet, but I think we can't let go of the human psychologist, not just yet. Um, Physiologically, when you're having that, I guess it's always like a fight or flight type response if you never know what you're coming home to and got to be ready to protect yourself. Um, how do you feel, about is that part of what's contributing here?
Yeah, certainly it's circumstantial. I mean, you just happen to find yourself in a situation that is negative in some way. One of the things that happened in recent times, as a matter of fact, is people, lots of young people when they were either kids or adolescents have had their wisdom teeth removed. And at the beginning, when all that was happening and people were going in for dental surgery, they would then get prescribed an opioid after that. So
Hmm.
you're having your wisdom teeth removed, you're in some pretty considerable discomfort, and you start to take an opioid. And research has shown that in as little as 2 weeks of taking a substance like that, you can form a dependency. And then you find that you actually, when you stop taking it, you have this real feeling of withdrawal. And the feeling of withdrawal and the fear of withdrawal is one of the primary problems with addiction. I've talked to so many addicts, as mentioned, over decades of time. And one of the things that they experience is they're so afraid of not having the substance on which they're dependent. Because the feeling of withdrawal, you imagine what withdrawal is like if you're taking an opioid or alcohol or a benzo or something like that that forms a dependency, and then suddenly you don't have it and you go into that hard detox, it's really uncomfortable. So, it's important to point out that, when you take some kind of dependency creating substance, the addiction can be developed in as short a time as a couple or a few weeks. And the anxiety about that can itself be something that is motivating in terms of using the substance more often or more frequently. So, yeah, it's really a complex human situation that we certainly continue to struggle with.
I think in my nursing medical experience, I haven't met a lot of people struggling with addiction that woke up and decided, this is how I'm going to cope. I think it usually happens the first substance kind of by accident. Um,
Yeah.
as much as someone offering you a cup of coffee, you're at a party, somebody offers you a hit of something. Um, and, we're not going to talk about date rape, drugs, and things like that, but even that kind of experience for somebody that is susceptible, that could be triggering. something. I did not know my family's addiction generational background. And in college, my ex-husband and I, we were at like a carnival and those skee ball games, where you collect tickets for getting the ball in the white hole. Well, I'm just having fun. I'm competitive because I've got a competitive personality. But within a half hour, like we weren't even married then, but my future husband stopped me. He says, "Whoa, they're just tickets. Calm down." And apparently, I had gotten so into getting those tickets, I wasn't even enjoying the game. But my future husband recognized that this was not a normal behavior. He said, "I'm never taking you to a casino because God knows, you will go broke." Um, and then, 10 years later, I got to meet my family and realize, my mother was actually a professional bookie and a bartender all her life. And I certainly had the genes and the background. Um, so when you mentioned withdrawal, there's a lot of people feel like they're not going to be successful or they're weak if they just can't do it cold turkey on their own. Um, and I want to bring out, in case anybody hasn't experienced those things yet, it actually is a life emergency. It needs to be under medical supervision. Um, and you had written a book that we discussed on our last show, Opioid Odyssey. And we talked about the Suboxone and some of the choices that are out there now. Um, do you feel that that's effective? And is that something that needs to be long term for somebody that's battling this? Uh, or do they have other options?
That's a great question. And one of the things that I saw in the book is I interviewed, many adults who had successfully recovered. So basically, the book Opioid Odyssey is about how the basics of the biochemistry of opioid dependency and what it is and what it isn't, and how many people have recovered successfully. It really is possible to have a thriving and successful life even though for a certain period of time during your lifetime you may have been dependent on a substance. And these are people who have really succeeded at the process of recovery. And when you think about what that is, what does it mean to recover? So it means that you are able to deal with the vicissitudes of life, just everything we all need to deal with in the course of our days and the weeks of our life without having to have recourse to some kind of artificial substance, whatever it is, whether it's food or alcohol or drugs, that to deal with the process of completing a task or overcoming any adversity or dealing with any adversity over time. So that's the process, and it certainly is possible to do that with the support and care uh, that you need. And
From the
it,
professionals.
and
Yeah.
certainly that's what the book is about, and it can happen for sure.
Okay, we're going to take another break here. And I think I'm also seeing that we need to have more than one show on this topic for sure. It's very intense, but we'll be right back.
Did you know that your beliefs create your entire reality, but it's the subconscious beliefs that do most of the creating? Belief shifter and life coach Shiraz can help you identify those limiting beliefs and eliminate them, often in a single session.
Like it was almost instant, like I had relief right away.
Creating better health, relationships, careers, and finances. Let Shiraz help you step out of safety and into awareness.
Definitely something's happening. It's like a flow inside. It feels good.
Whether in person or online, Shiraz provides personal coaching, belief shifting. Visit Shiraz at energeticmagic.com or call 416-529-7429. Energetic Magic. Find your greater happiness. Be well. Be aware. Be magical.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of the Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on the Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Hi, welcome back to the Holistic Nurse with Peggy Smith and Dr. Michael Murphy. And um, honestly, I did not realize how big and complicated this topic is, Dr. Mike. I think because this is Mental Health Awareness Month and addiction of many kinds affects so much of the population. Next week we're going to do a part two. But today, can you talk a little bit about how trauma is stored in your body and a little bit of that?
Right. So one of the central things I think is to understand what trauma is and how normative a lot of this stuff is. And what normative means is that it's pretty normal for all of us to have suffered some kind of trauma. And you think about it as a spectrum. I mean, for example, in my generation, a lot of the guys, young men, certain percentage of them, they enlisted in the service and they ended up getting sent to Vietnam. I mean, they thought they were doing a good thing, that they thought that they were serving their country, that they wanted to be good guys, and so they joined the service and they ended up in Vietnam, where they experienced things that were really core to the development of trauma. And what does that mean? I mean, trauma is when an event occurs to a human being that you just believe cannot be real. Okay, it's so extreme on the range of violence or the range of negative experience that it just seems like it's impossible to believe that it can be happening. And that's what a lot of these mainly young men experience in Vietnam. And they went there thinking they were serving their country, and they found extreme violence, explosions, people getting grievously harmed, witnessing all that, themselves perhaps being wounded and suffering kind of a physical invasion of their body by explosions and things like that. So they really came back uh, as a different person than the person who went over to Vietnam in the first place. And that is trauma. I mean, trauma is something that your brain just can't really believe is real. And so what happens is that biologically and neuroanatomically, it does not get programmed into long-term memory. So if we think about normal memories in our past, like our when we went to our prom in high school, something that was a relatively enjoyable experience, and you remember it, this part of your brain called the hippocampus gathers all the different sensory elements of that experience and retrieves them. It's memory retrieval. So they're stored in all the different areas of the brain, and the hippocampus goes to this file cabinet, that file cabinet, another file cabinet, brings out the olfactory part, the sensory part, the visual part, the auditory part, and brings them all together. And then you go, oh, that's what my prom was like. And you remember it. It actually comes back, and it's sort of a gut experience in your belly. You can really feel what it was like when you bring back an old and very important and powerful memory. So what happens with trauma, though, is that those memories get stuck in what's called working memory. And working memory is the stuff that we need to do right now, today, this day. These are the urgent things that we have to pay attention to right away. That's called working memory. It's in the frontal part of the brain, and it's as if it's on the desk right in front of you. I got to pay attention to this. That's what trauma is. It's always there. It's not like it goes away. These guys would come back from Vietnam, and I would talk to them, and they would say, it's like it happened yesterday, or it's like it happened 15 minutes ago. They still were activated by this experience that may have happened 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So the thing about trauma is that it doesn't age out. It does not erode with age. It stays there until it is addressed in some kind of way. And those are the issues that we're talking about now. So first of all, it's important to understand that what trauma is, and that it is this thing that feels like it just happened, even though it happened, may have happened long ago, and that therefore you really have to look at it as a problem in how the information is stored in the brain. And so that's something that really has become much more recognized now. We're starting to understand that trauma is um, a cognitive storage process, cognitive storage
And
and
I think as far as the Veterans Administration, the medical field that associated with, they've been doing a lot more recently to understand that and provide services and therapy dogs, and, for PTSD, things like that. That are just so maybe next week we'll also talk about how to access some of those services. Um, and a lot of people feel just a natural sense of shame and guilt when they're not strong enough to get beyond this. Maybe you have family members say, "Oh, you're not there anymore. Grow up, stay in the present." And um, that's easier said than done. And it's kind of like if you lose a loved one and you're struggling with grief, and people say, "Well, it's been 2 years now. You should be over it. Go find another one or something." People mean well when they say things like that, but they don't really. It's because they feel helpless, actually, that they can't help you feel better. I think that's the motivation behind comments like that. Um, but when we were kids, if you had a mental health problem and the counselor said, "Tell your parents you need therapy," your parents were like, "How could you embarrass our family like this? Why don't you just, you shouldn't do this to the family, Um, and it's not even like, "I'm sorry you're not feeling good, kid. What can I do to help you?" But that was a generational thing. We were, continuing the
yeah.
trauma. Um, we really are gonna, have to watch our time with today, but would you like to talk a little bit, maybe just about maybe the shame cycle, and then, that briefly, that there is respect. You don't have to be ashamed, and I'm not going to say you shouldn't have these feelings, because feelings are feelings, and they're an entity by themselves. They're not something to be judged. It's where you are at that moment.
Yeah,
But
here's a really important observation of that is that during World War II, the war ended at the same time. And so tens of thousands of people came back to the United States after the victory in Japan Day and the victory in Europe Day. They came back and they were celebrated as heroes. Whereas the guys from Vietnam, they came back one at a time. They didn't get celebrated. They were, as you say, they were connected with shame. Vietnam was a bad war. You did a bad thing. So they didn't get that sense of reward for their suffering. And that made those memories much more likely
painful.
to be
Yeah,
problematic. Yes. And
right.
so the difference in the environment of how the memory gets encoded, whether the person gets a sense that it's a terrible thing that happened, but it's okay. I did it for a purpose. I get rewarded for this. It's actually a good thing that I did. Is totally different. So you can see how the situation really determines the the effect of the memory, and how negative the memory may in fact be perceived by the person.
Right. My adopted father is a veteran, was a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And one of the highlights of his life before he passed away, he got to go the honor flight they have for the veterans. And
Yeah,
he was just so moved, and he didn't think anybody really cared about old soldiers anymore, and,
right,
what they went through. And I don't know that we have those kind of things for the younger ones at this point.
right, right.
But
So those guys had much lower levels of PTSD than did the Vietnam guys, or even the ones with the more recent wars in Iraq and other places like that, where the people are not celebrated as heroes because of the sacrifice that they made. It, so that talks about how does trauma get established? It makes such a big difference as to how it is perceived and um, whether the person is seen as having done something good in the process of the sacrifice that they made.
And, the process is a lifelong process. You're not just, you may have higher points in your life where you're coping better, but I think it's always with you. Uh, I have to mention some of the holistic approaches too, since I am the holistic nurse. We have a lot of tools. We have, what's in your field of psychology and psychiatry. There's a lot of holistic approaches that can enhance the process that you guys are doing, therapy wise and with medication. Uh, and I think the general population, the doctors are integrative doctors are understanding things like breath work and meditation. Exercise is a good way. It's not going to take away your feelings,
Exactly.
but it increases chemicals in your brain to be able to see the whole picture with a clearer mind. Adequate sleep, eating the right foods. You are what you eat, so you try to eat healthy things, not inflammatory things that make you feel worse, even if you didn't have an addiction problem. Music, art therapy, all of those are really helpful things, and just general mindfulness practices, but they're not substitutes for the actual medical and psychiatric care that and support that one needs when they're dealing with something this intense and this kind of trauma. And it doesn't mean that you failed as you didn't grow up to be a successful adult because you couldn't cope. And maybe, there's been studies with twins where two people have exactly the same childhood and then they're exposed to trauma as adults and they still like coping differently. Um, it's one child is successful, the other one grows up thinking that, I'm defective somehow. So this is really a very complicated topic. And I think people that don't have people, and if that's possible in your family, maybe in this struggle, it's important to just be compassionate just to the human spirit. And and speaking of the human spirit, that's what's going to get people through this process. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, the human spirit is miraculously strong. It can get you through, just incredibly impossible things that you could imagine. Um,
Certainly that's the case, and I think we see the differences in how human beings have had very different responses to different situations. And usually that has to do with the spiritual or emotional component. Was it a meaningful experience? Did it have a purpose? And usually just drug dependency and drug abuse is not perceived as a virtuous thing, so it's negatively connoted. So the person feels shame, and it actually is a negative experience, more likely to be associated with trauma than something else in which you feel like you did a good thing for your society and for your family and for yourself. So those are the issues that we're fundamentally dealing with now. And I think we're understanding them in new ways that really is starting to improve our ability to serve and help others who have this issue.
Okay, well, we're going to take our final break, and when we come back, you can tell people how to reach you about your book and maybe a little bit of the direction we're going to take next week in the show. Some of the things, and just let people know there's lots of hope in this with this issue. We'll be right back.
Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness: Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals. Did you know that your beliefs create your entire reality, but it's the subconscious beliefs that do most of the creating. Belief shifter and life coach Shiraz can help you identify those limiting beliefs and eliminate them, often in a single session.
Like it was almost instant, like I had relief right away.
Creating better health, relationships, careers, and finances. Let Shiraz help you step out of safety and into awareness.
Definitely something's happening. It's like a flow inside. It feels good.
Whether in person or online, Shiraz provides personal coaching, belief shifting. Visit Shiraz at energeticmagic.com or call 416-529-7429. Energetic Magic. Find your greater happiness. Be well. Be aware. Be magical.
Hey, welcome back to this week's the final segment of the Holistic Nurse with Peggy Smith and Dr. Michael Murphy, and we're discussing trauma as it relates to the origin and the experience of addiction. This is part one. We decided on one of our breaks that this is a very important topic that we need to present a lot of resources for and more information. So next week will be part two. And Dr. Murphy, how would you like to close out the segment? The stage is yours.
So I think it's important to point out that what we call trauma really is, as odd as it may sound, a normative part of existence. All of us experience suffering and fear and change and loss over the course of our lifetime. So it's important to think about what we call trauma as existing on a spectrum, like everything else. And it's negative human experiences. And so the real question is, how do we cope adaptively with the stressful and challenging aspects of our lives? And so that's really what this is fundamentally about, coping adaptively with the stressful and challenging aspects of our lives. And so one of the maladaptive ways of coping with that is using alcohol or drugs or other sort of artificially pleasurable substances to feel better in the short run. But really, recovery involves learning skills that we'll be talking about, I think, in our next show at some length, that really help us to learn how to manage negative emotional states and stress in the long run in healthy ways and more adaptive ways. So that's the critical thing. And one of the things that I was talking about, we were mentioning earlier, is the book, Opioid Odyssey. You can find it on Amazon. It's a happy opioid crisis book. It's all about how people have recovered successfully from substance dependence when they've gotten into substance dependence in all kinds of a multitude of ways. But still, all of them were able to recover successfully and have very productive lives. And these are their stories, how they did it, what you do in order to do it, and the kind of environments that support successful recovery. So that's the fundamental thing. And we'll be sharing those insights more next week as well.
I appreciate that. And again, going back to our original show, your addiction is not your identity. And taking that with my perspective of holistic doesn't just mean acupuncture and, yoga and things like that. It means looking at all areas of your body and your mind and your spirit, so that, because you need all of those factions, all those parts to be healthy for you to truly enjoy life. And, look at the story of Anne Frank, how she survived, uh, she didn't have the professional help to know, but she had a spirit and, I guess, a strong faith that got her through some horrible things. And, it offers hope to those of us. And just because somebody's situation, isn't yours, or you say maybe they weren't suffering as much as I was, nobody can judge. Nobody knows what's going on in somebody's mind and what they've experienced truly. And two people could have identical experiences and experience it differently. So I think we're going to go into that a little bit more. Um, do you have anything to add to that? We have a couple more minutes.
That's certainly true. And I think that what you're talking about with the holistic approaches are just great tools that people can use. I mean, they're readily accessible for everyone who wants to go on the internet and just ask, ask about meditation, ask about all kinds of other healthy ways to manage your psychological and emotional state. And really, that's what it's all about, is learning how to calm down and how to feel positively, using the tools that are healthy for us. And I think learning those skills is really helps us to understand that recovery is really about learning how to deal with our addiction to maladaptive ways of coping with struggle in more successful and adaptive ways that are better for us in the long run. And it certainly is possible, and it's a very hopeful new direction in the field of recovery treatment.
So, well, that is wonderful. I really appreciate you coming on the show this week, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation next Saturday at the same time. That would be 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The Holistic Nurse. If you know anybody who would benefit from this information, um, please watch send them to YouTube at the Holistic Nurse with Peggy Smith, and like and subscribe and share it, and let everybody know to come next week. And we'll have a lot more information and specifics on how to survive and be successful and thrive. Not just survive, but thrive.
Just to
Thank you for
mention one
coming.
more thing, Peggy, I can just
Yes.
mention, if people wanted to reach me, I have a website at psychologicalinvestigations.com. So if you just go on the internet and type in psychologicalinvestigations.com, they can reach my website, which has my name and address and phone number, and some of the material that people might like to read in this whole field.
So that is wonderful. And we will see everybody next week then. Thank you for coming today. And I can't wait to finish the story here. This has been great. I appreciate having you. Have a
Thank you
great
so
week.
much for the
Okay.
opportunity. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
This has been The Holistic Nurse with host Peggy Smith. Tune in each week where you're encouraged to send in questions and receive private responses and suggestions if appropriate. Here's Saturdays, 1 p.m. Eastern.